Okay, I'm just going to talk off the cuff about the situation big blind 3-bet versus button. So, button opens 2.5 big blinds, small blind folds, and big blind 3-bets to 13.5 big blinds, and button calls. So, this is assuming that it's 5% one big blind rake, which is a little bit higher rake than 500 NL on Bovada, which is fine. Um, could talk about how 3-bet ranges and continuing versus 3-bet ranges change at lower rake, but yeah, with this as a baseline and kind of talking off the cuff. But basically, the button opens like 45% of hands, fairly linear. I mean, not exactly linear, but like, fairly wide and, a lot of ace X hands, all pairs, all like 5x suited plus, 9x offsuit plus, and then some other stuff. Uh, Big blind 3-bets polar. So basically, closing the action big blind. Uh, Big blind has the opportunity to close the action by calling, obviously, or folding. But yeah, so by calling, so basically, in the small blind, or like if button opens 2.5 and we're in the small blind, well, now we have to worry about the big blind. So if we, like a hand, like hands that like queen jack suited, jack ten suited, these types of hands, then they would probably just prefer to call. They're not really three betting as a bluff or value per se. It's kind of in the middle, and so they just prefer to call, see a flop, and flop a draw or flop top pair or middle pair or something like that. But you're not closing the action in the small blind, so therefore, when you call, you can get squeezed by the big blind, and that sucks. And you're going to get squeezed often because uh, basically, as the original raiser starts raising more and more often, then the big blind or like players behind can squeeze more often. So after the button opens and the small after the button opens, then small blind isn't going to have much of a calling range because they're just going to get squeezed by the big blind pretty often, and now they're out of position against the big blind and out of position against the button with a presumably capped range because that's you're not calling with like aces or kings, queens, ace king from the small blind versus the button open. And so what happens is that basically the small blind just plays 3-bet or fold versus a button open. I mean, at least that's the case at 5% one big blind rake. There's more calling at lower rake because, well, basically you're getting a better price, so to speak. Like you're, you have to call, like if they raise 2.5 big blinds, instead of calling 1.5 to win 6, then, or 1.5 to win 6 big blinds. And then also you're basically risking a tiny bit extra because of that higher rake. Then at lower rake, then you're paying less rake. So then you just win more of the pot, whatever your EV is higher. All players' EVs are higher at lower rake. Um, and so basically, yeah, at the like at mid stakes rake or below, then small blind versus button. Small blind is not going to have a is not going to have a call range. They're just going to 3-bet or fold, uh, fairly linear and strong. But the big blind versus the button open, they can't get squeezed behind, and they have the option to just call and see a flop right away. Like they don't have to worry about getting squeezed. So, so therefore, hands like queen jack suited, they can call if they want to. Um, so then, what do we do? Well, we threw at a more polar range. So we can also call with like eights, sevens, sixes, fives. We don't have to 3-bet those either. So basically, you always want to 3-bet, or at least at this rake structure, you want to always 3-bet like tens plus, and I think like nines as well most of the time. Uh, from the big blind versus button, and you want to 3-bet ace king, ace queen, ace jack suited, king queen suited. These types of basically value hands, or they basically function as value hands. You get called by worse, and you have reasonable equity and reasonable EV when called, and you can continue versus a 4-bet. And so you need to balance it out with bluffs, and so basically, like closing the action, we can just 3-bet like not total airballs. Like you're not going to 3-bet 7-2 off or something like that, but like usually you're going to be 3-betting toward the bottom of your, or the middle to the bottom of your continuing range. So like with your offsuit hands, then you continue with, or like you 3-bet often with near the bottom of your continuing range. So like there's 2.5x, and big blind always continues 9x offsuit, and that's basically the bottom. Like I think king x offsuit folds always. So like king 9 off is a good 3-bet, jack 9 off, 10-9 off, and then the lower offsuit aces, a7 off, ace 5 off, blah blah blah. And then for the suited hands, like a lot of the suited connectors want to 3-bet, and like 10-7 suited, 10-6 suited, stuff like that. These hands can basically 3-bet large because we're out of position, and we want to reduce the positional disadvantage. So basically, you can 3-bet and get them to fold like ace 10 off, king jack off. Whereas if we call, then we're dominated by those hands. So we 3-bet polar, and when we 3-bet to 13.5, then now all of a sudden button is going to be folding most of the time, because they are, they only invested 2.5 big ones, and now the big blind pops it up to 13.5, right? So button is going to be folding like, I don't know, 2/3 of the time or just over that. And, because they're in position, they don't have to 4-bet as much as, like, if they were out of position, then they would just be like 4-betting and calling as often as each other. So like they would be folding, if they were folding 65% of the time, then they would be calling versus the 3-bet 17% of the time and 4-betting 17%. But because you're in position, you're just going to realize way better, even if, when you call, you're going to have weaker range than the big blind. Or like you're going to have less nuts and stuff, blah, 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 blah. You're going to have less overpairs on low boards, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't really matter because you're in position. So you can, you can 4-bet less because you're in position. Like you want to, or you're a little bit less incentivized to 4-bet to decrease the stack to pot ratio. Like you want to decrease the stack to pot ratio usually when, well, obviously when you get money in with your value hands, but as far as position, then when you're out of position, then you'd rather raise and decrease the stack to pot ratio, which allows you to stack off wider. So like, if you raise from the hijack and you get 3-bet by the button, then with your ace king off, well, you're not really in a great spot calling or 4-betting, but 4-betting is a little bit better because you can just 4-bet and decrease the stack to pot ratio. So when you get called, then going to the flop, if you hit an ace, then you're just stacking their ace that calls the 4-bet. Whereas like if you just call pre versus a 3-bet, then well, if you call pre versus the 3-bet, then you can also just like check raise the flop and get it in. But you basically want to decrease stack to pot ratio as quickly or like as early as possible to decrease the positional edge. Like as stack to pot ratio is higher, then it's more advantageous to be in position. So button versus the big blind polar 3-bet is going to, they're going to 4-bet like jacks plus probably, like, okay, kings and queens always, aces most of the time and jacks most of the time, and then like ace king pretty much always, and then like bluffs and stuff like whatever jack eight suited stuff like that. Some ace x suited, some ace jack off, king queen off, and so basically the calling range is going to be fairly middling and less capped than if small blind three bets. And basically, a lot of that is because big blind three bets larger, and so then aces can just trap more. Like with a lower stacked bar ratio, I mean, yeah, because big blind has three bet larger, they lowered the stacked bar ratio, and so like button has less incentive to four bet with aces because they're just going to be able to get stacks in easier anyway at like if the I don't know what the stacked bar ratios are in those two situations, but basically it's like a difference of stacked bar ratio of like 5 versus 4, and so it's slightly less stacked bar ratio than aces can get stacks in easier, and so they don't need to four bet. Yeah, so aces traps a little bit more. Jacks also traps a bit more. Well, they're not really trapping, but they're just not four betting quite as often. And so like the calling range is mostly like tens through like threes, tens through fours, something like that, and a lot of or basically all suited broadways. Uh, Most ace queen off because like at this point, ace queen off is too strong to four bet fold, so we just call versus the three bet. Whereas like if we open from the cutoff or hijack or low jack, then we would just mainly just be four better folding or like four betting ace queen off a lot more often because it has good blockers to their five bet range. But with ranges being wider than or after button opens, then button doesn't want to four bet ace queen off nearly as often versus the small blind or big blind, but especially versus the big blind. Well, I don't want to say especially versus both, yeah. So so yeah, buttons call range is like tens through threes, ace queen off, a little bit of aces, a little bit of jacks, all suited broadways. A decent amount of 9x suited, and some ace x suited, like ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited. I'm not sure about any of the other ones, but I would think like versus 13.5 big blind three bet, then like ace, ace 7, ace 6, ace 3, ace 2 suited can just fold versus the three bet. Ace 9 suited probably just calls pretty often. I don't know if it four bets at all, but an ace 8 suited, who knows? So basically, what happens is that big blind clearly has a way more polar three bet range than the button calls with. And so like polar as far as big blind has more big pairs that they three bet, but they also have a lot more just random bluffs. King 9 off, queen 9 off, 10 9 off, like we talked about. 10 6 suited, blah, 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 blah. And they have less of the medium to low pairs. And so, yeah. So, like, basically what happens. So Big Blind has more polar range. And basically, when you have the polar range, then just as a very general rule, then you just want to generally use medium to large sizings to target buttons condensed range, like to attack their like medium to weak pairs, basically. Um, and pre-flop, like I said, then the big blind three bet range has more nuts. So like, yeah, and then second pot ratio is fairly low. As I said, the big blind three bet's larger to decrease the second pot ratio, so then their positional disadvantage is not quite as severe. It still is going to hurt them. Whereas, like, if they were in position, then they would have a huge EV advantage. Like, for example, like big blind three bet versus small blind. Like, the average equity is that the big blind three better has, it's like 50% equity, but then they capture like 57% of the pot on average. But the big blind three bet versus button, because they're out of position, then they have like somewhere around 50% equity and like 49% EV captured. So a lot of the EV from the big blind polar three bet strategy is the three betting pre-flop to try to get folds, because if 68% of the button's range is going to fold versus three bet, then they're doing okay with that, or like they're doing reasonably with that strategy to get folds pre-flop. But once they don't fold, then the button is just going to have a reasonably okay shot at defending against the big blind post flop. So the big blind has a more polar range, meaning more nut hands, like big pairs, and more bluffs. And the big blind has, like I said, more nuts, and they have the positional disadvantage. So button is going to over realize compared to equity. I mean, it's pretty close because big blind has a stronger range, but they're out of position, so then it kind of evens out, I guess. And then second pot ratio being a bit lower means, or it like helps big blind to be able to stack off with their over pairs like the vast majority of the time, which kind of helps considering that big blinds, like a lot of big blinds range is just like tens plus, like, and then like ace king as well, like on an ace high board, and obviously they're just going to be able to stack off ace king or ace queen on most runouts. Okay, so like post flop, then big blind. We would assume big blind does pretty well on double Broadway boards and triple Broadway boards, because still, like, basically they're going to brick buttons middling to low pairs, and big blind has more of the big pairs that are going to hit sets on those boards. So then, like, big blind is going to be wanting to put in a lot of bets for small sizes to target the medium and small pairs. And yeah, and then like on zero Broadway boards, so like, I don't know, 742, 873, zero Broadway rag boards is what I mean. Basically, big blind's going to be doing reasonably well because it mostly, like, well, I mean, it's going to improve button as far as button's going to have more sets, that's for sure, and more two pair plus in general. But big blind oftentimes is going to hit some two pair on that, or like on the low rack boards, and so then they can, they can do some stuff, and they can see that fairly frequently. Not like extremely high frequency, but pretty high frequency considering that they have a polar three bet range, and like their main value range. The main value range for big blind is over pairs, And so what do over pairs want to do on low rack board? They want to bet half pot to 3/4 pot and then just ram it in on the turn, or or like 3/4 pot the flop and jam turn if they're over pairs, and then like maybe like the aces over pairs. The best over pairs can either trap on the flop or trap on the turn. Check call turn or check jam turn, whatever, and or half pot the flop and half pot the turn with your over pair and call a jam. Yeah, paired boards generally are going to be better for the pre-flop raiser in most situations because like it's going to help big blind to maintain their big pair advantage. Monotone boards, who knows? I don't spend any time on monotone boards because it's kind of like they're only 5% of flops possible. Like, yeah, only 5% of the time will a flop come monotone. So, who really cares about monotone? Um, Straight boards, I mean, it's basically going to be similar to rag boards. Like, I think the double and triple Broadway boards will favor the big blind, and uh, yeah, and also like the on rag boards and probably straight boards as well. Like, basically because the button calls with a more condensed range, and given that they call very high frequency with ace queen off, and ace queen suited, and that they call pre with aces at some frequency, then ace high boards are going to be pretty reasonable for the button. And so like there's going to be a decent amount of checking in the big blind shoes. At least that's what I would expect. And let's see. And then like king high boards, like universally are just great boards for the pre-flop raiser in like every situation. It seems like, except for maybe like low jack versus big blind singular pot or something like that. But and even then, it's probably still a good board for low jack, but just not quite as good as ace high boards in that situation because low jack will raise more ace x than king x, so then they'll have more of an advantage on ace high boards. In general, when the big blind c bets polar, and by polar I mean like basically repping like overpairs plus or bluffs, then and for like especially for like half pot to three-quarters pot, betting most of or like 50 to 80% of the time, then they leave their checking range a lot weaker. Like their checking range is a lot weaker. Big blind's checking range is a lot weaker than big blind's betting range. And so like, if on 742 or something like that, big blind's half pot betting range is going to contain like 22% overpairs or better. And basically then their checking range is going to only have like 10% overpairs or better. So then vast majority of their range is going to be air. So like the betting range is like, well, so the checking range is pretty polar. It's just going to be a lot of air, and so then basically in position can stab like 50% or more of the time for like quarter pot with just a lot of their range because big blind just leaves their checking range really weak. Big blind just wants to check fold. They're like the hands that like bluff 3-bet pre-flop and have just completely bricked the board, like no extra or like no backdoor flush draw, no backdoor straight draw. Those kind of hands just want to check fold, unless they see bet. Yeah. So like, yeah, and even though out of position is going to leave their checking range pretty weak, then and yeah, if they check really high frequency or something, 70%, 80% of the time, then their checking range isn't going to be as weak. It's going to be a lot more protected. But yeah, so if we're c-betting polar, but then we decide to check, then that increases in position ZV because now they get to stab often and just force folds from our air. And as out of position, we're out of position pre-flop raiser, then we'll still check raise often, even if we leave our checking range weak. Then when we do check and they bet small, then we can check raise like, at the very least 10% of the time, but usually like 15 to 25% of the time. Basically, with the remaining over pairs that we didn't see bet, plus, some top pair and some, whatever. And then we just check call our sets and trappy, just let in positions, just keep barreling. Uh, Especially because it's lower stack to bar ratio, so then we just want to check and just let them punt in their top pair, or let them punt in a draw, or let them punt in some air, or just let them start to put in some money with like whatever, some ace high or something where they can turn a draw and keep putting money in. Basically, that's how you get your money at the lower stack to bar ratio with netted hands. I mean, unless you're c betting really high frequency as out of position, but yeah. So like, so basically, like when big blind is c betting polar, or their betting and checking ranges are polar, then whether they bet or check is going to vastly change both players' EVs. So if big blind is c betting 70% of the time and they bet this time, then in positions EV just goes way down, and out of positions EV goes way up. And if big blind checks, then in positions EV is going to go way up, and big blind's EV is going to go way down. And they construct their range that way on purpose because, I mean, you need more EV to invest more money. So if you're checking, you're putting in 0 more big blinds. But if you bet like half pot, you're investing like whatever 13 big blinds, and so you need to have a higher EV. Yeah. And what happens in this situation if big blind checks and in position checks back? Guess what? Now out of position has checked fairly weak. I mean, they're somewhat protected with like overpairs and sets and stuff, blah blah blah, but pretty weak checking range. Well, in position checks back really weak. So once it goes check check, then all of a sudden big blind is back to having similar EV that they had on the flop before betting or checking. So if they had an EV advantage on the flop, like for example on like the low rack boards, then out of position has the EV advantage. Then after check check on flop, then out of position is also going to have the EV advantage on turn in the turn probe line. So I'm sure that happens in other situations, but I haven't noticed that before about like how drastically EV changes depending on the line. Like, yeah, surely it's the case with other situations, but like the EV goes from like whatever it is, like in position has like an EV of like 11 point something out of like a 26 big blind pot. And then once out of position bets, then in position's EV goes down to like 9. And if out of position checks, then their EV goes up to like 14. So basically what happens is that they're at a disadvantage and they only have like whatever. They capture like 44% of the pot or whatever it is. And then once big blind checks, now all of a sudden it flips and in position has 56% of the pot captured. So it switches once out of position checks. So that's kind of interesting, I guess. And certainly I don't think that is the case like button versus big blind with like wider ranges and higher stack to bar ratio than like even if in position checks back flop, then maybe their EV goes down from like 60% to like 54% or something, but it's not like it flips from like 44% EV all the way up to like 56%. Like maybe it goes down like 5 or so percent, but or down or up, but yeah. And since the ranges are so tight, I guess ranges are pretty tight, then like the specific ranks matter a lot. So like, so for like big blind three bet versus button, then like because in position has a lot of ace queen off, and because they have aces and stuff, and they have like a more, and like they have a tighter range, like they call tighter than big blind three bets pre, then all of a sudden they're probably going to start to do pretty well on ace and queen high boards. Whereas like on king high boards, then the big blind three bets pre with a lot of king X hands. Maybe not a lot, but I'm pretty sure they have more king X, decent amount more king X hands than button calls with pre versus the three bet. Especially because like big blind three bets like king nine off and stuff. Maybe queen, maybe king eight off too. I can't remember, but yeah. And so like the specific ranks matter a lot. Um, but the general overview is that big blind three bets pre with a more polar range. They have more nuts. Uh, Big blind is out of position, which kind of hurts them, and stack to pot ratio is a bit lower than a small blind three bet versus button, or like if you three bet in position, you're three betting a lot smaller as well. So yeah, so it's kind of an interesting dynamic where like not only are we three betting a polar range, aka more low equity hands, but we're also out of position. And so like going into the flop, then it's a strange situation where yeah, it the one thing holding big blind together is that they have a ton more of big pairs and ace king. It's holding them together. If that wasn't the case, then they would just implode, and in position would just have super high EV. But obviously that's why big blind three bets pre, because or why they can three bet polar is because it is higher EV than like three betting to like, instead of like three betting to 13.5 big blinds, if you three bet to like 10 big blinds, it would just be lower EV, strictly lower EV, because then you're just giving button a good price to call wider and stuff, and like then you just instead of being able to three bet with like 10-6 suited, then you just have to call basically, because yeah. And also I could talk about what happens to the big blind three bet range when rake decreases. So when the rake decreases, then the big blind three bet range becomes less polar, a bit less polar, not way less polar. And like the main reason that it gets less polar is that with lower rake, well, okay, with lower rake, the raise first in ranges don't change much. Or 45. If you're raising 45% of the time from the button at high rake, you're also going to be raising that frequency at low rake. So that doesn't change. So the raise ranges don't change. At lower rake, or sorry, at higher rake, then you fold more and you call less. But at lower rake, you can call more. So basically, what happens is if the button opens, small blind folds, and big blind three bets, even to the same size as the higher rake, then the button can call more often versus the three bet. And so the big blind's three bet is not going to be as successful because they're just going to get called. So what does that mean? It means that you can't three bet as many like so-called pure bluffs, like the king nine off, queen nine off, blah blah blah. Those kind of hands, which are like kind of middling hands, middling to weak hands. You can't three bet those as much, and so instead, then you just three bet more of like 10-8 suited and stuff like that, which is going to hit more draws and stuff post flop. And even though yeah, I'm not sure about the actual equities of 10-8 suited versus king nine off. I mean, maybe I guess king nine off may have similar equity to 10-8 suited, but 10-8 suited is simply going to flop more like draws and flop more blah blah blah. So like at lower rake, then when you're three betting from the big blind, then you're going to care a bit more about how your hand plays post flop. King nine off plays terrible post flop, but it's pretty good for blocking the continuing range pre flop. So it goes down in value once the rake decreases because they're just going to call more often with like queen eight suited and stuff. And so then you're just going to be out of position with king nine off. Like their folding frequency goes from like 68% to like 60%. So like most of the EV of king nine off is from three betting and getting them to fold. But if they're not going to fold, then you just have to three bet more like hands that can actually flop some stuff post flop, even if they have less blockers. Like blockers are more important at higher rake, basically. Like I guess it's kind of an interesting dynamic. Also at lower rake, since there's more calling than than what I talked about before or like earlier, that versus a button 2.5x open, then the small blind doesn't have a three or doesn't have a call range. They just three bet or fold pretty much. Well, at lower rake, then they start calling a lot more often because now we can just call frequently with queen jack suited, queen ten suited, jack ten suited, stuff like that. The medium to low pocket pairs can call more often. Like they don't have to three bet or fold really anymore at lower rake. At no rake, they can just call even more often. But so basically what happens is that at lower rake, then the EV of all your hands goes up. And so you can just VPIP a wider range as, facing an open or whatever. So like raise first in, you're not getting more fold equity. So it doesn't actually make sense to raise wider at lower rake because, your EV is going to be higher post flop, but also your EV pre flop, they're going to fold less often versus your open. So then kind of evens out and then you just raise the same range. But continuing versus opens, then and continuing versus opens and continuing versus three bets, then you're going to be able to call more at lower rake. You're just not punished by the rake as much, so then you're okay with calling and seeing the flop more often. That's helpful. Big blind three bet versus button. So with the polar three bet range, it's similar to big blind three bet versus small blind. The main difference is that big blind three bet versus button, you're out of position, whereas big blind three bet versus small blind, you are in position. So I have no idea what the difference in c-bet frequencies are, but for sure, big blind three bet versus small blind, then because you're in position, then the pre-flop caller is out of position and they just have to fold more often versus your c-bets. So then you can use small bets more often. And big blind three bet versus button, well, you don't have as much automatic fold equity because they're in position. They can just float you. If you decide to bet 10% pot, they can just float you with anything unless it's a board that crushes your range and then, they don't even have the ability to float versus your 10 to 25% pot bets. So being out of position, we just have to play more polar versus or like for c betting and just playing post flop in general and facing bets. Like I said, then you call less often and you fold more often and raise more often. So like if you check flop and they bet in position quarter pot, then you're just gonna be check raising all of your overpairs, and then like your like top pair, middle pair type hands can just call along with your sets, as I said. So it's like, so it seems like the calling range actually is pretty weak, but the overpairs just want to get it in, especially being out of position. You just want to raise and get it in. Whereas like otherwise, if you're in position and you face the bet, then you could just call and just see what they do the next street or whatever. See the next street and just, see like, do we want to stack off here? No? Okay, then just keep calling or fold at some point. But as out of position, it's just like our hand is good enough right now. Let's raise and get it in or whatever. If you have an overpair or you have say like top pair, top kicker, a lot of the time you just, you know, if when you stack off, you're gonna be ahead of some of their value and you have fold equity now, then you can just raise and get it in. And so it's not even just for value that you're raising with those hands. It's also just denying equity. Like if you check raise and they fold two overcards or even one overcard plus vector flush draw, then that's a success because like if you just check call with an overpair, then like if they hit, they're just gonna keep barreling and then you just have to keep calling. And if they don't hit, then they just have the option to check back and just see two streets for the price of one and hitting on you and outdrawing you, or maybe like a bad run out comes out and they get you to fold or whatever, even though it's unlikely when you have an overpair at pretty low stack point ratio. But yeah, so like yeah, I think this is an interesting situation, the big blind three bet versus button, where like you just three bet a bunch of just basically just total garbage. I mean, it's not quite as polar as the big blind three bet versus small blind range because we're out of position, so we have to be tiny bit less total bluff heavy, but still a lot of pretty much bluffs. Like a lot of hands that probably versus the calling range will have like 30 some 40% equity, something like that, which is pretty crappy. Whereas like the small blind three bet range, it's like the worst three bets are like low frequency suited connectors, and then mostly like the lowest equity hands are like the 9x suited, and even those can flop decent, especially against the pocket pairs. So yeah, basically you just closing the action. You as the big blind three bet polar for large sizing to decrease stack pot ratio to decrease the positional disadvantage. And then, I mean, for the most part, it's just like if it's a really good board, you just bet really often for small and get them to fold their medium and low pairs, or at least start getting them to fold those. If it's a medium to crappy board, then you check somewhat frequently to really frequently, uh, and you size up usually to like half pot or three quarters pot. Main value range overbears, blah 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 blah. That's trap because we're out of position. We're gonna face bats more often because of the 50% rule. Because yeah, I mean basically in position is going to bet around 50% of the time when we check. So with our sets, half the time we get a bet out of them. Whereas if we bet ourselves, then we block their continuing range. You can just check call it down with a set, and just close your eyes, check call it down, and like obviously on a good run out or whatever, then you can check jam the river. But I feel like we just repeated ourselves like 3 times, but still, I think this is helpful. I guess just thinking about how the ranges interact and the different factors and stuff. And like obviously there are specifics that like like ace high boards, king high boards, 10 high, 9 high boards, blah blah blah. Like maybe like 9 high boards are better than 10 high boards because 10 high boards, then blah blah blah. Oh yeah, like one main way to know if a flop type or like a flop rank hits the pre-flop caller's range is looking at the offsuit hands they call with. And what's the main offsuit hand that button calls with versus the big blind three bet? Ace queen off. So ace high boards and queen high boards are either going to be kind of like not super great for the big blind or just utterly garbage. And in this case, especially ace high boards, because they call with some aces pre, which it basically just like makes us less likely to want to stack off with like ace queen or ace jack, especially like on ace high boards. Like ace queen can't really stack off because, or I mean, they can stack off, but like not as easily because not only are you chopping against ace queen and in position has a lot of ace queen, but you're also losing the aces. So you just get coolered whatever fraction of the time. And like, if you bet flop 3/4 turn, or like say you half pot flop 3/4 turn in a jam river, then whatever percentage of the time you're just getting coolered by aces, or they make two pair and you get coolered that way. So ace high boards are not so great. And they don't really call any other offsuit hands. So like all the other ranks should be pretty reasonable, where like on all the other rag boards, then I'm pretty sure like overpairs could just stack off flop and turn if they want to, like 3/4 flop and just jam turn, or half pot flop and then half pot turn and call the jam on turn. So like a lot of it is just recognizing what the ranges look like, who is at the advantage, who is at the positional advantage or disadvantage, and what does that mean? And and a fairly low stack to pot ratio, then it's just like you just figure out what hands want to stack off and what hands don't want to. And some hands want to stack off, but they don't have the urgency to put in the money themselves because like basically like the sets, they don't have the urgency to put in the money because we basically we don't have 100% equity, but we have a lot of equity. And so like a lot of equity and EV. So like the sets, obviously they want to stack off, but they want to let button stack off. Put in the money basically. And then like overpairs and like top pair that can stack off, and a lot of time like two pair as well. Then those hands will just big blind will just put in the money themselves to get value from like medium to low pairs, and like depending on the board, then getting value from like ace queen high, ace jack high, king queen high, like floating flop and stuff, blah blah blah. And then maybe they turn a draw and barrel it off and get value against their draw while you still can. And again, because you're out of position, you want to lower the stack to pot ratio. So like with an overpair, you just want to bet, get it in on the turn, or like I said, half pot flop, half pot turn, and then I don't know what the river jam would be, but something around half pot. So yeah, big blind three bet versus button. Big blind three bet's polar, so they have the 10 plus advantage, and then they have a lot of bluffs. Or 10 plus advantage and ace king, and a bunch of bluffs. So they have the big blind has more polar range, button has more condensed range of like medium to low pairs, suited broadways, some 9x suited, some ace-x suited, and not much offsuit hands except for ace queen off. and big blind is going to have more pre-flop nuts and like tens plus. So then that's going to help them on double and triple Broadway boards. Big blind is out of position, which is counteracted by the fact that they have the nut advantage. So those two kind of counteract each other. Stack to pot ratio is fairly low, so big blind can still can stack off their overpairs whenever, however, but they prefer to just, especially as out of position, just get the money in now because yeah, I mean just get the money in now while we can still get value from medium to low pairs and like before the run out gets too bad to not be able to stack off. And yeah, you basically just figure out what hands want to stack off and like not only pure hand strength. Okay, we have an overpair here, but also like thinking about in positions range as well, because like there are definitely some boards where, or like specifically, like I said, like the ace and queen high boards where they're pretty bad boards, and when in position makes a lot of like two pair plus, then now all of a sudden our overpairs are no good anymore, and we just want to check a lot. Like I would predict, yeah, on the queen high boards and stuff, these high boards, like mono boards probably similar. Paired boards kind of just get the money in. There are very few pairs, mostly just unpaired hands, and that'll help big blind generally. Um, Straight boards, I guess it kind of depends on the board ranks and stuff, but overpairs can't stack off as much on straight boards. Well, yeah, I'm not sure about straight boards, but in general, similar principles as rag boards, except less ability to stack off means less betting from big blind on straight boards than rag boards. I don't know if that's true. Should be fairly similar, I guess. But especially like on like 8-7-6 or something like that, then button's just going to make a lot of sets that big blind doesn't have, and so then we would imagine big blind would just have to check a ton on that board. And like even if they're at a disadvantage, even if big blind is at a disadvantage on that board, and button has more sets, then once button stabs off in for small, then big blind is still going to be check raising quite aggressively with overpairs. So even if it's a bad board, even if you lose against sets and stuff, pretty often, then oftentimes as out of position anyway, you just want to check raise. So like if it's a good board, then you just want to bet yourself with your value. But then if it's a bad board is out of position, then you want to check raise a lot of your overpairs and just get it in anyway. Like even though it sucks that you lose your sets, lose to their sets, then I think in position should be checking back a decent amount of sets anyway at low stack par ratio. Could be wrong about that, but yeah, I guess so. Like big blind has the more polar range. Big blind has more nut hands. Big blind's out of position, and stack to pot ratio is fairly low. So just for the most part, you just want to stack off over pairs, and so that's either just bet jam or bet big on flop in jam turn, or check raise flop in jam turn. All of those are reasonable, and honestly, it's a small difference between those options. Now, what do we bluff with? That's kind of more awkward or like thought, because I don't really know the ranges super well, but like yeah, it would be definitely something to look into what we're bluffing with. Like our value hands are the most important, but when we have so many just total airball bluffs, then on any different run out, then we could just have like gut shots and flush draws and stuff that people wouldn't expect. And so choosing your bluffs is not always going to be simple or easy, but it's important. Yeah, I think this video has been fairly helpful for me like, to parse out what's going on. Maybe like I'd kind of like to do this again with maybe like button versus big blind, where like I have a reasonable general idea of stuff, but maybe like I haven't said it out loud or haven't written it down or something, like specific thoughts that I have and like connecting that to different situations and stuff. So yeah, I think this type of studying is helpful where it's you kind of like figure it out on the fly. Like looking at sims and stuff is cool. Playing against the solution is cool. Looking at the specific ranges and seeing like what percentage of blah 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 range has blah 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 number of sets or whatever is cool. And comparing the two pair plus advantage and stuff. But we generally have an idea of that stuff, and like we do a lot of like I do a lot of that kind of study. So like this, just talking out to myself, then it's kind of I'm kind of like teaching myself and like figuring out stuff, and like where if I say something and then I'm like, maybe I can realize that it's faulty logic, or maybe it's good logic, and like, I never thought about it, but like, and like, a good example is, I thought about this a little bit in the past when I was studying small line three bet versus button, but now it's more obvious that like, as out of position, with your overpairs, as long as your overpair is good enough to stack off, you just want to get it in. So either bet jam, bet big and jam turn, or check raise, get it in. You want to do one of those things with your overpairs generally, unless it's a board where, you know, imposition has a lot of two pair plus. In that case, then you don't want to stack off your overpairs. Then you're like probably just checking a lot and just check calling instead. Like on monotone boards, like I'd expect um, less stacking off of overpairs, but it's kind of an interesting concept. We're like if we're in position, we'd be a lot more likely to bet small, or maybe not small, but to bet medium, like to bet like 50%, 50%, and then jam river, or like 50%, 75% jam river, versus like now, like it seems like it's more of an option to go like 75% and then jam turn. Or like obviously like as in position you can't check raise flop, but as out of position you can check raise. So it the check, or like the facing frequent small bets from in position, or like when in position frequently bets small, obviously that decreases your whole range, your whole checking range, because you just have to fold a lot, and like, even when you check call or something like that, a lot of those hands aren't going to be super high EV anyway, but they're higher EV than check folding or whatever. But the benefit is that with like your overpairs or something, then your overpairs go up in EV, because if you're going to face a frequent bet, you can check and get a bet out of them, and then you can raise and get them to fold equity, fold like reasonable hands. Uh, so yeah, like even though playing as out of position, like you are at a disadvantage as out of position, but there are some advantages. So like in general, playing as in position, then your one pair hands and your zero pair hands are going to go up in EV as in position, because you know your bets get more folds, and your checkbacks, you're not going to face bets as often, and you can get to showdown easier. So like the two main goals in poker are to, or maybe not the two main goals, but two main goals with showdown value are to get folds and get to showdown. And then like the third one is not for showdown value, but the third one is just to get value, or whatever, get called by worse and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, when you're in position, well, you get more folds and you get to showdown easier. So your one pair and zero pair hands just go way up in EV. Whereas your two pair plus actually go down in EV because you're in position. Actually, They may not go down in EV, but they probably just stay the same, I guess. Yeah. Okay, this video is gonna cut out, so I guess I'll be done. GG.